I believed marriage would pull us closer, not push us apart. But a little over a month after we said, "I do," my wife shut every door between us and repeated the same sentence whenever I tried to understand. "My body, my decision, no exceptions." What she saw as a final boundary became the moment I chose a legal exit, and what unfolded after that choice took a turn neither of us was prepared for. Before I tell you how that decision changed everything, do me a small favor, tap subscribe, leave a comment about where you're listening from, and help this story reach the people who might need it. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 33 when I learned that a marriage can look whole on the outside and be hollow at its center. I taught 3rd grade at Riverside Primary School in Columbus, Ohio, a job that taught me patience, routine, and the quiet ways people reveal who they are. I thought those skills would help me be a good husband. I didn't realize I'd need them to survive my own home. Lila and I had been together for over a year before the wedding. We met at a district conference, me there for curriculum workshops, her representing Lakeshore Community Services as a social worker assigned to school families in crisis. She listened the way professionals do, attentive, calm, validating. When she smiled, it felt deliberate, like she chose the moment. Our first date stretched into hours over coffee at Riverside Cafe, where we talked about everything except work. She told me about growing up in Indiana, about her parents' divorce, about learning early to depend on herself. I told her about losing my father in college and how teaching pulled me back from a dark place. We fit easily, or so I thought. We lived together for 6 months before the wedding. We shared groceries, split rent, argued lightly about where to hang pictures. We were intimate then, affectionate, warm, present. So when we married at St. Matthew's Hall and posed for photos with family and friends, I believed we were sealing something already alive. For weeks later, I was sleeping alone. It didn't happen all at once. The first few nights after the honeymoon were tired and ordinary. Then Lila started choosing the guest room, saying she needed space to sleep. When I reached for her hand on the couch, she shifted away without comment. Kisses became quick, like punctuation marks instead of sentences. I tried to be patient. I told myself marriage was an adjustment. One evening, sitting on the brown leather couch I'd bought years earlier when I thought I might never marry, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Can you help me understand what's going on?" She didn't look up from her phone. "I've told you already." "Told me what?" I asked. She finally met my eyes, calm and firm. "My body, my decision, no exceptions." I nodded, because that's what I do when I don't want to escalate. "I'm not demanding anything," I said. "I'm asking why you won't even sit close to me." "You're married to me," she replied. "That doesn't give you access." The word access landed wrong. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich, turkey and Swiss, the same lunch I packed for school most days. Standing there, chewing, I remembered something from our premarital counseling at the Hale Family Guidance Center. Counselor Andrew Hale had asked what we wanted from marriage. I'd talked about building a family, about closeness that deepens over time. Lila had said marriage was about stability and partnership. I'd thought that meant maturity. Now it sounded like a mission statement. Looking back, the signs were there. She insisted on separate accounts. She deflected conversations about long-term plans. During counseling, when Andrew asked about intimacy, she spoke in careful generalities. I heard caution. I didn't hear a refusal. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November. I cooked dinner. We ate in silence. She went to the guest room with a book. I sat in the living room staring at our wedding photos and felt something settle into certainty. This wasn't a phase. This was the design. I remembered the counseling recordings. Andrew had asked permission to record sessions for his notes. We'd both consented. The next day, during lunch at school, I called him. "Ethan," he said gently, "how are you settling in?" "I need to ask about the recordings," I replied. "Do they still exist?" There was a pause. "They do." "Why?" I told him what Lila had said. I told him I believed she hadn't been honest about her intentions. He sighed. "If you're considering legal steps, you should know those recordings can be relevant." That evening, I waited in the driveway before going inside. Lila was reheating soup. I asked about what she'd said in counseling about marriage being security, not closeness. For the first time in weeks, she paid attention. "You wouldn't use those," she said. "Those were private." "Were they honest?" I asked. She crossed her arms. "I gave you a partnership. If you expected more, that's on you." I opened my laptop and began researching annulment procedures in Ohio. Fraud. Misrepresentation. Words I never thought would apply to my marriage. When I filed the petition, Lila was furious. Then careful. Then conciliatory. Breakfast appeared. Apologies softened. Promises floated. I almost believed them, until her lawyer called it vindictive and predicted the court would see me as controlling. That's when I called attorney Rebecca Sloan. "Do you have evidence?" she asked. "I have recordings," I said. "And consent." She listened to samples, then sat back. "This is clear," she said. "Not easy, but clear." I picked up the envelope from Andrew and spent an evening alone in my classroom, listening. Lila's words, steady and unmistakable, described a plan built on stability without closeness, partnership without affection. Signals instead of honesty. After the wedding, we'd address it. I understood then that my marriage hadn't failed. It had been misrepresented. I didn't sleep much that night. I organized files. I prepared timelines. I chose truth over comfort. And as I shut my laptop, I realized something else. Once evidence steps into the light, certainty changes sides. The days after I listened to those recordings moved differently, like time had lost its usual rhythm. At school, I taught multiplication tables and read aloud from worn paperbacks, smiling when my students raised their hands. Inside, my thoughts replayed Lila's voice from the sessions at Hale Family Guidance Center, steady, certain, methodical. She hadn't stumbled over her words. She hadn't sounded confused. She'd sounded prepared. At home, the atmosphere shifted again. Lila sensed it before I said anything. She watched me the way someone watches a door they know will eventually open, whether they want it to or not. On Sunday evening, she cooked dinner. A real one. Not reheated leftovers, not something rushed. She set the table with our wedding plates, lit a candle she'd bought months ago and never used. The gesture was so deliberate it almost felt rehearsed. "I think we started this wrong," she said as we sat down. "Marriage is an adjustment." I was scared. I didn't handle it well. I listened without interrupting. "We can fix this," she continued. "We can talk more. We can take things slowly. There doesn't have to be lawyers involved." I took a bite of the food. It was good. Too good. "What changed?" I asked quietly. Her eyes flicked away for half a second. I realized I was being unfair. I nodded. "Unfair how?" She reached across the table and touched my wrist. The contact felt unfamiliar now, like a language I no longer spoke fluently. "I pushed you away when I shouldn't have." For a moment, the version of Lila I'd fallen in love with sat across from me. The thoughtful listener. The woman who woke up early to drink coffee with me. The one who laughed softly at jokes meant only for her. That version almost convinced me. Almost. "What did you expect marriage to look like?" I asked. She hesitated. "Like a partnership. Support. Stability. And closeness?" I pressed. "Affection?" Her jaw tightened. "I told you my boundaries." "Yes," I said. "You told me after the wedding." The candle flickered. The silence stretched. "I didn't think it would matter this much to you," she said finally. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never asked." The next morning, I met with Rebecca Sloan in her office downtown. She was calm, efficient, the kind of person who didn't dramatize facts but didn't soften them either. I handed her the recordings. She listened with a legal pad on her lap, occasionally pausing to jot notes. When she finished, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't about boundaries," she said. "This is about intent." She explained how annulment differed from divorce, how misrepresentation before marriage mattered more than conflict after. The recordings mattered because they showed planning, not confusion. "She didn't change her mind," Rebecca said. "She withheld information that would have changed yours." That afternoon, I picked up the official copies of the recordings from Andrew Hale. He looked older than I remembered, lines deeper around his eyes. "I wish I'd pressed harder," he said quietly. "Some of what she said should have been said to you directly." "You did your job," I replied. "You recorded the truth." When I got home, Lila was waiting in the living room, papers in her hand. "My papers." Her lawyer had responded. She read aloud parts she thought would hurt me. Words like rejection, autonomy, consent. She said the court would see me as a man angry because he couldn't control his wife. "Is that how you see me?" I asked. She shrugged. "It's how it will look." That was the moment the last thread snapped. Not anger, clarity. I understood the strategy. I understood why the dinner, the touch, the apology had appeared when they did. That evening, I played a short clip from one of the counseling sessions. Just 30 seconds. Her voice, calm and unmistakable, describing marriage as security without emotional demands. Lila froze. "You can't use that," she said. "Those were private." "They were honest," I replied. She stood so fast her chair tipped over. "I'll say you're lying. I'll say you pressured me." "You can try," I said evenly. The court date was set for January. In the weeks that followed, the story shifted outside our home. Friends noticed. Colleagues whispered. Some assumed we were just another couple struggling early on. Others sensed something deeper but didn't ask. At school, parents stopped Lila less often. Her warmth had thinned, replaced by something sharper. Children sense tension the way animals sense storms. The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep. I organized timelines, highlighted transcripts, and packed everything neatly into a folder. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing to present reality. When we stood in Franklin County Family Court, Lila sat beside her attorney, composed and confident. Rebecca sat beside me, calm and alert. Lila's attorney spoke first, framing the case as punishment for refusal, as a man unable to accept a woman's limits. The words were polished, persuasive, familiar. Then Rebecca stood and played the recordings. The courtroom changed. Lila's own words filled the space, explaining expectations she'd never shared with me, plans she'd assumed I'd accept, signals she thought were enough. The judge listened without expression, then asked to hear them again. When Judge Eleanor Price finally spoke, her voice was steady. "These recordings indicate deliberate concealment of material facts," she said. "Marriage requires good faith from both parties." Lila tried to speak. Her attorney stopped her. The annulment was granted. Costs assigned. Gifts returned. Finality declared. Outside the courthouse, Lila looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "I never thought you'd do this," she said. "I never thought you'd need me to," I replied. As I walked away, the weight I'd been carrying for months lifted, not because I'd won, but because the truth no longer needed defending. And I knew then that the sharp turn wasn't the court's decision. It was the moment I stopped questioning my own reality. After the ruling, life didn't snap back into place the way movies pretend it does. There was no triumphant music, no sudden relief that erased everything before it. What came instead was a strange quiet, the kind that settles after something heavy is finally set down. Lila moved out within a week. She packed efficiently, without drama, placing things into boxes with the same careful precision she'd always used when organizing closets or planning schedules. We barely spoke. When we did, it was about logistics, who would keep what, when utilities would be transferred, how to handle the lease. The emotional conversation people expect after something like this never came. It was as if she had already rehearsed leaving long before the wedding ever happened. Word traveled faster than I expected. At Riverside Primary, a few colleagues asked gentle questions. Others avoided the topic entirely. I didn't volunteer details, but the outline was enough. An annulment. Misrepresentation. Evidence. The whispers filled in the rest. People have a way of connecting dots in ways that say more about them than about you. Lila's work situation shifted more noticeably. Lakeshore Community Services reassigned her caseload quietly. Parents requested different social workers. Nothing was said outright, but the pattern was clear. Trust, once questioned, doesn't easily rebuild, especially in a profession built entirely on credibility. One afternoon, Andrew Hale called to check on me. We spoke briefly, carefully. "I keep thinking about what you heard on those recordings," he said. About how long she'd thought this through. "I do too," I admitted. Not with anger. Just disbelief. "Sometimes," he said, "people confuse safety with connection. They think one can replace the other." After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, replaying moments from the past year with new clarity. The way Lila deflected questions about the future. Her insistence on everything being equal to the dollar. The absence of warmth when things didn't require performance. None of it had been accidental. A month after the annulment, I received an email from her attorney confirming the return of wedding gifts and the payment of court costs. Formal. Polite. Final. It felt like closing a file rather than ending a marriage. I began reclaiming small pieces of my routine. I rearranged the living room, donated items we'd bought together, repainted the guest room that had become a symbol of distance. The brown leather couch stayed. It had been mine long before the wedding and felt grounded in a way few things did. Dating wasn't on my mind. Healing doesn't follow a schedule, and I wasn't interested in filling silence with noise. Instead, I focused on work, on students who needed attention, on the comfort of predictable days. Children are honest in a way adults forget how to be. They show you who they are without strategy. One evening, I ran into Lila at the grocery store. It was brief and awkward. She looked tired, thinner somehow. "Hi," she said. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by ordinary things, cereal boxes, fluorescent lights, the hum of freezers. The normalcy felt surreal. "I didn't think it would end like that," she said quietly. "I didn't think it would begin that way," I replied. She nodded, as if accepting a truth she could no longer rewrite, and walked away. That night, I thought about something Judge Price had said near the end of the hearing. Marriage is a contract built on good faith. Without it, the structure fails no matter how carefully it's decorated. Lila hadn't lost because she set boundaries. She lost because she hid them. Months passed. The sharp edges of the experience dulled, not because it mattered less, but because it settled into perspective. I learned the difference between empathy and self-erasure, between patience and ignoring your own instincts. People asked if I was bitter. I wasn't. I was precise. I knew now that closeness can't be negotiated after the fact. That partnership without honesty is just a transaction with better branding. And that walking away from something built on omission isn't cruelty, it's self-respect. The marriage lasted barely over a month. The lesson lasted much longer. And as I moved forward, I carried one certainty with me: the truth, once spoken out loud, doesn't just end stories, it corrects them. The months that followed reshaped my life in quieter ways than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations left, no legal paperwork arriving in thick envelopes, no messages from attorneys reminding me of what had happened. Instead, there was space, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling, and the slow realization that I had to decide who I was without constantly adjusting myself to someone else's limits. At Riverside Primary, my routine anchored me. The classroom stayed the same: bright posters, uneven desks, the faint smell of dry erase markers. My students didn't know anything about annulments or court hearings. They cared about spelling tests, playground arguments, and whether I'd remembered to bring the book I promised to read aloud on Fridays. Their trust was uncomplicated, and it reminded me how honesty should feel: simple, direct, unforced. Outside of work, my social world shifted. Some friends pulled closer, offering dinners and distractions. Others faded, unsure what to say or how to place what had happened. I didn't blame them. Situations like mine make people uncomfortable because they challenge easy narratives. It's simpler to believe marriages fail because of mutual mistakes than to accept that one person can enter with a plan the other never sees. Lila's absence became more noticeable over time, not because I missed her, but because I noticed how much I'd been accommodating without realizing it. The house felt quieter, yes, but it also felt lighter. I slept through the night. I cooked meals without wondering whether they'd be ignored. I made plans without bracing for resistance. Occasionally, I'd catch myself revisiting conversations from our engagement with new ears. Her careful phrasing. Her habit of agreeing without committing. The way she framed the future as something abstract and undefined. None of it had raised alarms then because I wanted harmony more than clarity. Now I understood that harmony without truth is just silence dressed up politely. One afternoon, Andrew Hale invited me to stop by his office. He didn't want to discuss the case, he said he'd done enough of that already, but he wanted to check in. "I've been thinking about how easily people hide behind language," he said as we sat across from each other. "Words like partnership and stability can mean very different things to different people." "I thought we meant the same thing," I admitted. "You meant the same word," he corrected gently. "Not the same definition." That stayed with me. As winter turned into spring, I began to feel something I hadn't expected: confidence that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. I wasn't walking on eggshells. I wasn't guessing. I was simply living according to what I knew to be true. That confidence showed up in small ways: speaking more directly, setting boundaries earlier, asking questions without apologizing for them. Lila's professional life continued to change as well, though I learned about it indirectly. A colleague mentioned that Lakeshore Community Services had reassigned her again, this time to a role with less direct family interaction. No one framed it as punishment, but everyone understood the reason. Trust, once questioned, reshapes perceptions in ways that policy never fully captures. About 6 months after the annulment, I received a brief message from her. No accusations. No apologies. Just a note saying she was moving back to Indiana to be closer to family. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to resolve. Closure had already happened in the courtroom, in the recordings, in the choices we'd both made. That summer, I took a trip alone, nothing extravagant, just a quiet place near the water where mornings were slow and evenings were honest. Sitting there, watching the light change, I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to interpret someone who never intended to be fully known. The relief didn't come from winning a case. It came from no longer negotiating with confusion. I began dating again eventually, cautiously. Not because I was afraid of intimacy, but because I now respected it. I paid attention to how people talked about boundaries, about expectations, about the future. I learned to listen not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. And when something felt unclear, I asked, directly, early, without fear of seeming difficult. What surprised me most was how often people appreciated that clarity. It turns out many adults are relieved when honesty is invited instead of assumed. Every now and then, someone would ask if I regretted filing for annulment instead of trying harder to make it work. The question always carried the same assumption, that endurance is inherently virtuous, even when it requires self-erasure. My answer never changed. I didn't leave because intimacy was denied. I left because honesty was. There is a difference between respecting someone's boundaries and being misled about the life you're agreeing to build. One is mutual respect. The other is deception disguised as principle. As the year moved on, the sharpness of what happened softened into something steadier, a lesson rather than a wound. I didn't carry resentment with me. I carried awareness. And awareness, once gained, doesn't fade easily. The final months of that year brought a sense of completion I hadn't anticipated. Not the dramatic kind people imagine, but the quiet certainty that comes when nothing is left unresolved inside you. By then, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt genuinely mine. Mornings started early, as they always had, but without the weight of tension waiting at home. I taught my students, stayed late helping those who needed extra time, and went home without bracing myself for distance or dismissal. The house no longer felt like a place where something was missing, it felt like a place where something false had been removed. Occasionally, I would hear updates about Lila through mutual acquaintances. Nothing scandalous. Just fragments. A new position. A different department. Eventually, the news that she'd left Columbus entirely and returned to Indiana. People spoke about it carefully, as if unsure how much sympathy was appropriate. I didn't correct them. Everyone processes truth at their own pace. What stayed with me most wasn't anger toward her, but the clarity of what I'd learned about myself. I had always believed patience could fix misunderstandings, that kindness would naturally be met with honesty. I understood now that patience without transparency only delays the inevitable, and kindness without boundaries invites exploitation, even if the other person doesn't see it that way. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer, I found our wedding album. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages slowly. The photos were beautiful. Smiles. Posed affection. Moments that looked exactly like happiness. I didn't feel bitterness looking at them. I felt something closer to compassion, for the version of myself who believed appearances were confirmation. I closed the album and put it away, not as something to hide, but as something that no longer needed my attention. When friends asked what I would do differently if I could go back, I didn't say I would have walked away sooner. I said I would have asked harder questions earlier. I would have listened more carefully to what wasn't being said. And I would have trusted the discomfort that tried to speak up long before the truth became undeniable. Eventually, I met someone new. Slowly. Without rushing. We talked openly about expectations, boundaries, fears, and hopes. Not as negotiations, but as disclosures. There was no guessing, no testing, no silent assumptions. For the first time, closeness didn't feel like something I had to earn or interpret. It just existed. That's when I realized the sharp turn in my story wasn't the annulment or the court ruling. It was the moment I chose truth over denial, clarity over comfort, and self-respect over the fear of being alone. Marriage didn't fail me. A lack of honesty did. And once that honesty finally came into the open, everything else fell into place exactly as it should have. If this story resonated with you, or reminded you that your instincts deserve respect too, do me one final favor, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and help this story reach someone who might be standing at the edge of a truth they haven't faced yet.